Hello everyone, my name is Kristen and I wanted to first start off by saying thank you to the San Francisco branch of the American Begonia Society for asking me to speak about Terrarium Begonia. This is my first ever presentation, so I hope everyone enjoys and learns a little something about Terrarium Begonia. A little bit about me before we get started. I am 30 years old. I am from New York. I'm currently living in Florida. I moved here at the end of September. For reference, it is October 10th, so I haven't been here that long, but I am new to Florida, so this will be a drastic difference for growing my Terrarium Begonia. Or will it be? I don't know. Since they're in terrariums, I feel like they don't know a whole lot of what's going on outside other than the length of the daylight and the intensity of the light, but we shall see. I will do some posts on Instagram if I do notice a difference, that's for sure. I am a nurse. I'm a registered nurse. I write former because I am not currently working as a nurse. I am self-taught when it comes to begonia, and I got my first begonia in May of 2021, and my first ever begonia is this lovely species over here on the right. It is Begonia species Sarawak, and I was just looking on Instagram in May of 2021 and I came across this species and I was completely shocked. I had no idea a plant could look this cool or this beautiful, iridescent, sparkly, just this plant has everything. And I've had houseplants since 2017, but just more of the common plants that you would find at, your local hardware store like Lowe's or Home Depot. I never had any type of fancy plant. And when I got this begonia, it was my first begonia, my first rare plant, my first terrarium plant, and my first plant that I ordered online. So it was a lot of firsts for me. And I'm so happy I decided to take the plunge with this species because, fast forward to October of 2022 and I'm still loving it just as much as when I first saw it. And down at the bottom left there, that is just a couple places where you can reach me. My Instagram is at Begonia Sarawak. My Etsy shop is Aesthetic Foliage. And that is a link to my Amazon storefront, which I know you can't click on it through this presentation, but if you go to my Instagram through the link in my bio, you'll see my Amazon storefront on there. It's just a little bit easier, I think, to get to because you can actually click it instead of writing this all down. So first is my show and tell. I wanted to quickly go over a few of the species that I have. I have round about 20, 25, 30, something like that. So not too many, but also not little either. So I feel like I have a good grasp on what's going on, at least for my collection, that is. So first, of course, let's talk about Begonia species Sarawak, the begonia that started it all for me. I write here it's not Begonia lichtenora because they are two different species. That picture below, the second picture there, in that little plastic container, the clear plastic, that's Begonia lichtenora, and the other two plants, the top picture and the plant above the clear plastic picture, is Begonia species Sarawak. I know it was going around in the plant community when this plant first came to light that they were perhaps the same because they do have some similarities, that maybe the Begonia species Sarawak was just a different form. I've had both species. I can say from personal experience they are definitely two different species, but furthermore, I can have proof in stating that they are two different species because I spoke to the journal article author of the Begonia lichtenora journal, and he stated that they are most likely two different species and that the article, the Begonia lichtenora journal article, was written for quote-unquote small form, or the one that's in the clear plastic there, not Begonia species Sarawak. He also stated that nobody that he knows of or that he's aware of is currently working on a name for Begonia species Sarawak. So just in case anybody is curious, they are two different species coming from the journal author himself. So that's just a cool little tidbit there. Begonia lichtenora, we kind of talked about that already. Begonia akita-jawiensis, and forgive me if I do not pronounce these names correctly, but I feel like everybody's had some trouble at one point or another saying these names, so just forgive me if I say something wrong. But Begonia akita-jawiensis, dark form. This is such a cool begonia. I think it's underrated personally. When I first got this plant, I was excited about it, but I wasn't, I guess, super thrilled about it. And as it's grown and as the leaves have become bigger, and just the texture and the shine on this plant is just incredible. And also the flowers have these little hot pink hairs on them, sparse hairs on males and females, and it is the cutest thing. I really love this plant and how it looks. Very, very happy that I decided to go along with it. I'm also not the biggest fan of begonias with big leaves, but this one is so beautiful that I don't even mind the big leaves. The one underneath it is Begonia blankii mottled form. There's a couple different forms of this plant. I specifically chose this picture because you can see in the back there the rhizome is growing straight up out of the ground or out of the soil. And when I first got this plant, it was not sticking straight up like that. But I kind of had the idea, it just came to me that, if I pick the rhizome and I put it up, will it grow in a different way than it would if it was normally just, crawling along on the soil floor? And it did. It looks like a tree. They don't normally look like this. I've not seen another blankii look like this. So in case anybody has a species that has a rhizome and they want to, do a little experimenting with it or try something new, maybe try putting a support behind the rhizome. And I just secured it to using twisty ties. So I don't know, just a thought. But what I think is really cool is if you look down at the bottom, there's another offshoot coming up, and that does not have a support, yet it is going straight up. So it's almost like the plant is learning how to grow. And I think that is very fascinating because actually there's two offshoots down at the bottom and they both do not have a support, but they're growing up. They're not growing traditionally across the pot or across the soil. So I think that was really cool, and I use this picture on purpose for that reason. Next, Begonia xanthina, just Begonia xanthina, not variation lazuli. This begonia was first recognized in the late 1800s. However, an updated article came out in 2018, and my research partner, Coco Geek Plants, you can find him on Instagram, reached out to the journal author of the 2018 journal or article and asked for more clarification on the forms or the variations. And she said that because the plant had lacked physical type specimens, that they were getting rid of the variations. So I believe there was a variation lazuli, which was originally the plant that I would have here, which is with blue iridescence. And then there was also a variation, I want to say Pictrifolia. I could be wrong on that second one, but that one had spots on it. Both of them lacked physical type specimens, so they decided to forego the variations. So any kind of Begonia xanthina that's out there, it is just Begonia xanthina. There is not variations associated with this species anymore, according to an updated 2018 journal article. And I wanted to quickly mention here all this text that's in blue, where it says discovered, journal, type, section, distribution, habitat, and notes. These are quick little reference points that I've made, and I do for each species that I get, just so I have like a quick little reference guide when I get a new species. Just the basics really, and I make sure to link the journal article so that way if I want to read more in depth, or if I remember reading something but don't quite remember what it is, I have the journal ready to go. And then the notes section is what I was just talking about the 2018 updated article there. So just a little tip if you have quite a few species and you want to remember just, basics about the plant, just, maybe writing down some of the basics would help you, like it's helped me. Okay, now I have Begonia yenyenii. It was not technically sold to me. It was given to me by a friend, but I put sold because it's easier, but sold as it was a species Raja Johor. And I was going on, this was a few months ago, I was on the Novataxa blog, being bored and looking up new Begonia journal articles. I love that website. I originally found out about the website from Vagina Begonia on Instagram. She had mentioned it in her stories, and it's this really fun website. It has everything, not just begonias, but it has, all plants, insects. I believe it has animals also, of a culmination of all new journal articles for various different subjects. And so what I do is I go on the website and I'll just type in begonia into the search bar, and it'll bring up all of the new journals that are coming out for begonia. So I was on that website and I was just scrolling through, as one would do on a Saturday night. And I came across this picture and it looked so familiar to my begonia at the time that was known as species Raja Johor. So I read the article. I thought, hey, I think this is the plant that I have. So I took some pictures. I messaged a pretty prominent botanist on Instagram, kind of photobombed him with the journal article and some pictures. And I said, hey, do you think my plant could be this? And he said, well, it looks like it, most likely yes. So although it's not 100% guarantee that this is the species I have, pretty close confirmation, and I feel comfortable saying that it's Begonia yenyenii. Begonia tomentosa. This is such a cool begonia. It is not a terrarium begonia, although I've grown it in a terrarium and it does okay. I will say it sometimes doesn't like the very high humidity that a plastic bin or a terrarium or greenhouse can give. But so I use this picture for a reason. The one on the left is a Begonia tomentosa. It is an import that I got a while back. I believe it was the second begonia that I've ever purchased. And then the one on the right was not an import. I bought it from Hayana Ray's Dark Garden on Etsy, and she grows her begonia from seed. So as you can see, they look totally different. The import on the left just, it's growing a little wonky. It's not unhealthy by any means, but it just looks a little odd. And then the one on the right that was grown from seed, not an import, looks beautiful and lush and full, and that one is significantly younger than the import. So I think it just goes to show you, obviously genetics play a role into it. I'm not saying that, import versus not import is the only reason that these look different, but I do think it has something to do with it. And then those are the flowers on the bottom. Look at how cute they are. They're so fuzzy. Everything on this plant is so soft. It is coated in these tiny little white hairs, and it feels like puppy ears. Anybody that has a dog and you pet them, obviously, and you touch their ears, you know that the ears are almost always like the softest part on the dog. And I swear these leaves feel like puppy dog ears, like the softest velvet you've ever touched. I love this plant so much, and I try to get other people to love it as much as I do, but for some reason, I feel like nobody really wants to give this plant a chance. So, if anybody is out there and they have a chance to touch this plant, just touch it. Maybe you will love it and you will take one home, and it will give you as much joy as it's been given to me. I love this plant so much. I have multiple. um, and just a quick little side note, if you look to the left, I have a lot of text written for this species. There's not a whole lot of information on this begonia out there. So what I did was I found this website, and it had photocopies of all the original documentation dating back to the early 1800s. And some was in French, some was in German, some was in English, and I translated them and I formulated a timeline because online they were just kind of all mixed in. So I created this timeline for myself, just for, again, quick reference. So if anybody's interested, I can send this information to them. But yeah, just a little side note there for the species. Okay, Begonia ningmingjensis from Caobang. This is a gift that I received from a friend. It is very hairy and silver. It's my first kind of silvery begonia. And I have to say, at first when I got it, I wasn't thrilled about it. There was just, the leaf shape was kind of typical, and, the veining was kind of typical, and I just wasn't super thrilled with it. But now that it's getting older and it's starting to have some personality, I am appreciating the species a lot more. And it's from Vietnam. Okay, next we have Begonia species Tatua. And for anybody that doesn't know about the nomenclature with these plants, so the top one, see how it says Begonia ningmingjensis? Like, that is the name for the plant. And below it says Begonia species Tatua. So technically the name of begonias that have not formally had, a journal written about them is Begonia species. And typically, as an identifier of the plant, after the species, people will use an identifier for where the plant was first discovered. For here, for instance, it was Tatua, Sarawak, Borneo. So this begonia is, known in the trade as Begonia species Tatua because that's where the plant was found. And it doesn't have to be where it was found, but most often than not, that's what it is. Like recently, I just purchased a plant, Begonia species green, which is not the most informative name, but that's what it's, kind of going around as. So that's just a quick little tidbit. I'm sure most people know that, but just to clarify. Okay, then we have Begonia species Papua New Guinea, and as you can guess, this plant was discovered in Papua New Guinea. The one below that is Begonia species Caobang. It is found in Caobang, Vietnam, and I put there for the section, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that because I know I'll say it wrong, but if you look in the parentheses, it says most likely. And I put most likely because it is currently being worked on for naming, and I was speaking to somebody through Instagram, and they weren't working on the article, but their friend or their coworker or somebody that they knew was working on this species, and they told me that it was most likely this section. Now, obviously not set in stone, but that it's most likely. Okay, now off of show and tell and onto my setup. Now, as I just stated in the beginning, that I just recently moved I'm from New York, but I was living in Massachusetts, and I just moved from Massachusetts to Florida. So this was the setup that I had in Boston. I had the bottom picture there is a shoe rack with these small black glass terrariums, which had individual species in them. And then the top picture, I had stacked some plastic bins from Home Depot. And I first started off with just the shoe rack and the little black terrariums, but then as the plants grew, they needed a bigger home. Buying anything glass is very expensive. So I went the cheap route and got the plastic bins for the plants that were growing, and that just eventually turned into my mother plant bins because most of my mother plants were growing faster than my propagations, actually all of them. And then the top bin, which is kind of cut off, that's where I keep my propagations for the ones that I'm selling on Etsy. So that's just briefly my overview of my old setup. This is a different view, so you can see on top of that first bin there is my seedlings and my seeds. That's the only grow light that I use. I don't care for the aesthetic of artificial lighting, so I only used natural lighting from this west-facing window here. And like I just mentioned, the grow light I use just for my seedlings and my seeds. So just a few tips for setup. Fish tanks are great terrariums because of built-in vents, and they're also very cheap. So in the picture on the bottom left there with that black lid, that's actually a plastic, actually it might be acrylic. Well, it's either plastic or acrylic. Fish tank that I got on Amazon, I think it was under $30. And I needed something with a specific height to it, and I could not find it in a plastic bin whatsoever, so I had to be creative there. So just a heads up, if you need something with specific dimensions, try thinking out of the box and look up fish tanks. You might you might find something. I already mentioned the shoe rack as a shelving unit. Next one, use a kitchen rack inside a bin for levels, good for propagation. So in that top bin that you can see straight ahead, that is my propagation bin, and you can see that little white wire rack. That I use to kind of create a shelf so I can get more plants in the bin, because propagations aren't that tall. So I wanted to maximize my space as much as possible. So I used the kitchen rack to do that. And for low light plants, place behind taller plants for shade. So as a side note, I like to group my care. I don't like to really baby any one specific species. For example, having them in multiple places in my house because of light or because of temperature or humidity. I really don't care for that. I want everything in one place, so that way when I assess if something's going on, I can just see everybody all at once. So that can be tricky, but there are ways to go around it. Like for instance, if you look in that second bin there, you can see my Begonia blancii. My Begonia blancii is in the front, and that's quite a tall plant. And behind it, I have species cowbang and Begonia species sarawak, which are both low light plants. So they're in the same bin, they're in front of the same window, but they're different lighting conditions. And that was just a little trick in case anybody is wanting to emulate that. Okay, this is Terrarium Begonia Care, just basic care and basic products that I use. Everything that I talk about in this presentation and that's on my Instagram, I have on my Amazon storefront just to make it easy for everybody. So basic care, light, talked about this, indirect light from a west window, temperature 68 to 76, depending on the season. In winter, it's obviously a little bit more on the cooler side. In winter, it's a little bit on the warmer side. Water. Now, this is highly subjective and dependent on your specific growing conditions, your environment. So this is just as a reference point, don't just take it with a grain of salt. So water, I water once per week, sometimes every 5 days in summer. That's specific for summer. With distilled water only. and then I dilute fertilizer into the distilled water. Humidity, 82 to 95%, all as closed systems. And I give 1 hour of fresh air per day. So I'm going to backtrack just a second here. So the lids I will take off of the bin for an hour to 2 max a day. I notice if I leave it for over 2 hours, the plants start drooping and wilting. I guess it's just too much of a shock for them. But because they are completely closed systems, they have no air ventilation whatsoever. So I have to get air in that, fresh air in there somehow. So I will take the lids off for 1 to 2 hours a day. Fertilizer, I use Fox Farm Grow Big Plant Food 644 mixed with Fox Farm Bush Doctor Kelp Me Kelp You 0.50.5. And these are the first 2 products on the top, the Fox Farm products. And I previously used Bonide Liquid Fertilizer 10-10-10. I say previously because, as mentioned, when I first got my first plant, I didn't know anything about terrarium plants. I didn't know anything about begonias in general. So I asked the shop what fertilizer she used, and she told me that this is what she used, and I wanted it to be a smooth transition, or as smooth as possible coming into my care. So that is the fertilizer that I went with. And since I've branched out, I've become more experienced. So now I'm onto my Fox Farm products, and I use a mix of the two, those first there. And my soil mix are the bottom 3 products all mixed together. So I use 1 part Fox Farm Happy Frog potting soil. I use 3 parts Tiny Roots Akadama, 5mm pieces, and 1 part Dr. Verm's worm castings. This is the base for all of the mix that I use. Sometimes if I'm feeling frisky, I'll throw in some other things. Like I'm playing around now with a bonsai soil mix, and I'll throw that in, doing a little experimenting with that. But for the base of my soil mix, this is what I do. Few tips on basic care. As I mentioned, all of my things are in front of a west-facing window. In the afternoons, that does get direct sunlight, so I have to close the blinds to avoid direct sunlight. I have cooked one of my plants that way, so I don't recommend direct sunlight. A little controversial tip, so again, take this with a grain of salt, but if a begonia requires cooler temperatures to bloom, put it underneath an AC vent. I've done this with success, but I know that's dependent on a lot of different things. So just basically what I'm saying is you can get creative, but be careful also. To increase airflow, ventilation, use a deli lid to open the lids of my terrariums. I already talked about what I did with my bins. I take the lid off for an hour or 2 a day, but with these smaller glass terrariums, I recycle little deli lids and I'll just prop them open so they also get fresh air that way. And use a miniature squirt bottle for sensitive begonia. It avoids overwatering. I have been known to be an overwaterer. So these mini squirt bottles are an absolute lifesaver. I was just explaining to someone the other day that as an overwaterer, people can identify with this. You just feel the need to do it. It sounds like an addiction. Maybe it is, I don't know, but you just feel the need to do something to your plants, and that often translates into watering. And so I really like these miniature squirt bottles because the nozzle is so small and the stream of water that comes out is very thin. So visually, when you're watering with the squirt bottle, it looks like you're giving a lot of water, but you're actually not. And these bottles in particular I like because they're labeled, they're 4-ounce bottles, so you can actually see how much water you're giving. But the overwaterer in me likes seeing, so much water going into the pot, but realistically, it's not that much water. So I highly recommend these squirt bottles for people who have overwatering tendencies. Basic winter care tips: that you should be maintaining your fertilizer with each watering throughout the winter. Last winter, I did not fertilize. I followed the age-old trick of don't fertilize in winter, and I thought that that translated to begonias as well, and boy, was I wrong. I had a lot of leaves that looked like this picture here, the yellowing of the leaf, and leaf curling, leaf dropping. It just didn't grow at all. And that was because I wasn't consistently fertilizing anymore. I stopped, and then it took, well, this was a little while ago now, but I think it took like a month and a half for the plant to kind of get back up to normal with leaf production and not looking like crap again. So I do suggest, just from my experience, to continue to fertilize with each watering, and you might be doing it less frequently. So for instance, you might be watering every 10 to 14 days versus 7, as an example for me, but you're still using the diluted fertilizer per each watering. Also in winter, you want to make sure to not get water on the leaves, as this can lead to melting or ashing. I will also talk more in depth about this later on in the presentation. Continue to provide airflow. You might think, oh, because it's a little bit chillier in your house, you just want to keep the bins closed and not give any airflow. That would be a mistake in my opinion. I think it leads to mold and other various not good things. And also it leads to ashing and melting as well, at least in my experience. And if you do happen to get molds like me, I am a frequent mold flyer. The only thing I have found to be helpful in the fight against mold, cobweb mold in particular, is springtails. And again, I will be speaking about this topic later on in the presentation. Okay, now just some basic tips for root health. Do not compress the substrate. So when you're repotting your plants, don't push down on the top of the soil, because you want it to be airy and have some space inside the soil for oxygen and the roots. You want to utilize proper drainage using soil amendments of different sizes. You want to water in tiny increments. This is just beneficial in not overwatering. And using fertilizer with phosphorus or a complete fertilizer, and that just helps with elongation and branching and overall root health and strength. Okay, now just some propagation tips for leaf and stem propagations for my terrarium plants. For leaves, you want to find a healthy middle-aged leaf. So in the picture to the right, you can see that there are some green leaves and there's some pink leaves. You would not want to choose a little pink leaf, because that has not hardened off yet. It's still growing. It doesn't have the energy or the stability or the strength to sustain itself and produce roots and keep growing. It would just melt and die, unfortunately. So you want to choose a healthy middle-aged leaf, much like the other leaf in the container, that greenish blue leaf. That's a perfect leaf to choose. You also want to try getting as long of a petiole as possible. Now, in my opinion, this isn't a scientific fact or anything. This is just what I have found. I think that when you start off with a leaf cutting and a longer petiole, there's more surface area for the roots to come out of and grow. So versus a smaller petiole, there's less tissue for the roots to come out. That's just my thoughts on it. So you want to try to get as long a petiole as possible. And plus, if some of your petiole starts to melt and you have a small petiole, you won't have anywhere to go. You can't trim and hope to save the propagation. But if you have a longer petiole, then you might just be able to snip off the end and you still have some leaf and petiole to work with, so you could still get a successful propagation out of it. I love Akadama for propagations in general, whether it be leaf or stem. The smaller the size, the better. I mentioned before 5 millimeters. I know Tiny Roots also sells a 7 millimeter. I've also tried that one. I've tried both. I like the smaller pebbles personally, so I like the 5 millimeter ones, but I have heard that you can get smaller, and if I ever come across smaller pebbles, I will definitely try that. I would choose Akadama over sphagnum, over soil, over, I can't think of anything else off the top of my head right now, but out of any other substrate, I would choose Akadama to propagate with. Try not to touch it. This was a hard one for me, especially in the beginning of getting into propagations and just begonias in general. You know, you want to open up the lid and check 5 times a day if there's a little root forming. I don't recommend that because when you are fussing with it, you're just stressing it out even more. And the leaf is already stressed because it's just been cut from his home, from his family, the rest of the plant. So he's already under tremendous stress. And then if you're touching it and fussing with it and getting rid of the humidity by opening up the lid multiple times a day, it's just causing more stress to the plant. So just don't touch it. And my number one tip that I have found to make all the difference in the world, as soon as I started using deli containers to propagate my leaves especially, I almost always have a successful propagation. I don't know the science behind it. I can guess that there's just a higher density of water molecules in the air, and it's just an overall smaller environment. So perhaps it means that the leaf is not as stressed as it would be in an open greenhouse or an open bin. That's just my thoughts, though. That, like I mentioned, that's not scientific fact or anything, but since I started using deli containers, it dramatically increased my propagation game. For stems, I would try to choose a stem that has at least 3 leaves, because if one leaf starts to melt, you at least have 2 backup leaves. Again, I love Akadama. I provide wet conditions. I have just found that to work. I sometimes have melting, but most of the time I have successful propagations, and I just prefer more wet conditions or a wet environment. I don't do that in winter though, because I have seen that it leads to more melting and more mold forming on the propagations. So I do that in every season but winter. Okay, closed terrarium, so much like the deli container that I was mentioning before for the leaf. For the stem propagations, I use a closed terrarium, so whether that be a Tupperware container or one of the black glass terrariums that I showed before, or a plastic bin, just any type of enclosed space. You only use fertilizer after 3 to 4 weeks. This actually is for both leaf and stem propagations, because fertilizer can stress the plant out. And if you think about it, it might be misleading, because if you are new to propagations and you see that your plant finally rooted, you're very excited, you want your plant to grow strong and fast and healthy, so you give it fertilizer thinking that you're doing all of these things for your plant, but it's actually just causing stress to the plant. So try to withhold using fertilizer. I only start introducing fertilizer at the 3 to 4 week mark, and I will start by using fertilizer 1 week, and then when it needs another watering, I'll just use distilled water. So it's like I'll fertilize every other watering until it's really starting to grow and take off and it's been consistent putting out leaves. Then I will switch over to fertilizing it with every watering. And provide medium light. This is also for both leaf and stem and just propagations in general. Not low light, because you want your plants to photosynthesize and make roots. be healthy. And you don't want super bright light either, because that can also stress the plants out. I don't know the exact science behind that, but I have just found, and I've heard from other people in the plant community, that bright light seems to be a deterrent for the health of these plants, these propagations. So medium light is the way to go. Okay, now for the ending portion of my presentation here, I'll talk about some of the experiments that I do on my Instagram, which is Begonia Sarawak. I first started my Instagram as more of I wanted it to be more of a diary. And this was back when reels were not really, actually they weren't a thing at all. It was just pictures and what were they called? IGTV videos. And I wanted my Instagram to be more like a diary. Like I wanted to look back at my posts or look back at the pictures and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe it was this tiny, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then I started off with this first experiment here, Akadama versus sphagnum, which will root faster. And that was one of the first experiments that I did on my page, and I received a lot of positive feedback on that. Everybody seemed to really like that I did this experiment, and I had a lot of fun with it as well because I felt like a scientist. So that's how my contents shifted in that way, and I'm really happy to be doing these little experiments. I find them very helpful. I like helping people. I find it very fun also. So I will just talk about a few of the experiments that I have done recently and in the past. So the first one, Akadama versus sphagnum. Which will root faster? Akadama after 7 days and sphagnum after 10. So the answer is Akadama. Akadama roots faster. I took 2 leaves of similar size, similar age, and I put one in a deli container filled with Akadama and one in a deli container filled with sphagnum. And I checked on the roots every day and noted that the Akadama rooted faster. So that's kind of where it all kicked off, was with this one experiment here. Next one, I don't know how to say this word exactly, so don't laugh at me. Mycocorrhizae. And mycocorrhizae, or mycocorrhizal fungus, is a beneficial relationship between endomycocorrhizae and begonia roots. So it's not necessarily the fungi, it's the relationship between the fungi and the roots. And I have heard about this product, or not this product, but I've heard about this concept, this thing, and I wanted to try it out. So I did my research. There is 2 different types of mycocorrhizae. There's endomycocorrhizae and ectomycocorrhizae. The genus Begonia works with the endomycocorrhizae. So this is the product that I have found on Amazon that I love. I've used it on almost all of my begonias this far. And if for whatever reason you don't want to use this product, you just make sure that the one that you buy has endomycocorrhizae, because the other kind will not work with the begonia roots. So purpose, if I use this product, will it create a stronger plant? Results, yes. What was the tangible outcome? Flowering and growing at a much faster rate. So I really, really like this product, and you don't need that much. You might get it in the mail and think, oh my gosh, this is a tiny little package. I'm going to go through this in like 2 seconds. But I've had this for quite some time now. I want to say it's coming up on a year, and I think I've only used like half of it, and I've used it on, like I said, almost all of my plants. So it will last quite a bit, but again, if you have a larger collection than I have, perhaps you'll go through it quicker, but it looks small, but it'll get you far. Okay, worm castings. Well, worm castings yield a visible difference in leaf growth. So the results: 15% of worm castings has been found to aid in soil health and visible plant growth. There's been multiple studies on that. If you do a quick Google search, you'll find a whole bunch. In my experiment, I took two Begonia metallic color plants, and one I added worm castings as a top dressing, and the other I just left alone in its, regular soil mix. And what I noticed was actually interesting. I noticed that the worm castings helped with the number of leaves produced, but not existing leaf size. So if you look at the picture that I have associated with this here, the one on the left does not have worm castings, and the one on the right does have worm castings. And I thought at first when I did this experiment that worm castings would be like an overall miracle product. It'll make the leaves grow longer and faster and more of them, but that was not the case. It just helped in this obviously small sample size. It just helped with the number of leaves produced, but not the existing foliage. So the existing foliage on that plant to the right there didn't really grow for the length of this experiment. It just produced more leaves. And the one on the left that did not have worm castings focused more on the existing leaves and elongation and making those leaves grow. So I thought that was interesting. On to the next one, temperature over atmospheric pressure. This was a 2-part post that I did a little while back here. And I wanted to know, when I got my leaves wet, why they would not melt in summer, but they would melt in winter. In the first post that I made about this, I thought it was from atmospheric pressure and how atmospheric pressure drops in winter versus summer, and I thought it had something to do with that for why the leaves were melting. And it turns out I spoke with a few people on Instagram, mainly Sam's Bakes and Plants, who is a professor in this exact subject, so safe to say he knew exactly what he was talking about. And he said, although atmospheric pressure does drop in winter, it wouldn't be enough to see a difference in our plants that are on the inside of our homes. He suggested that it was from temperature, in that in winter, the temperature stays colder longer, so the evaporation of the water on the leaves is slower than than in summer. In summer, the temperature is warmer, so the water evaporates at a faster rate. And he suggested that that was more likely the reason for why my leaves were melting in winter versus in summer. And I am inclined to believe that hypothesis. Okay, same species, different coloring. So purpose, why did Begonia species Sarawak yield pink leaves in Academa and green leaves in Sphagnum? So in my first experiment where I talked about rooting in Academa versus in Sphagnum, I left the leaves in their respective substrates and I let them grow, and came to a certain point where I noticed, okay, this needs to be a post. The leaves in Academa grew in pink and the leaves in Sphagnum grew in green. And I wanted to know what the difference was and why that was happening. So through my many experiments, I believe the answer is pH. The farther away from neutral, or 7, the leaves will be green. And the closer to the pH neutral of 7, the leaves will be pink. And Cocoa Geek Plants, who I mentioned earlier, helped me come to this conclusion. We bounce ideas off of each other quite a bit, and this is what we have come up with. But at the time, I thought that it was access to fertilizer, because in my Academa deli cup, I have a small reservoir of fertilizer water at the bottom, and that was because I didn't want the Academa to dry out during the growth of the plant. So originally, when the plant was growing and the roots grew down through the Academa and into the fertilizer water, I thought that the answer was access to fertilizer because Sphagnum didn't have that, only the Academa did. So I thought that's why the leaves were pink. But since this happened, I have done long-term cultivation experiments with a few different types of substrates and rocks in general. And they all kind of led me now to believe that the answer is a pH answer and not access to fertilizer. In that the farther away from neutral, the leaves will be green, and the closer to neutral, the leaves will be pink. And sphagnum has a pH of about 3.5 to 4, somewhere in that range, and most Akadama, the pH is 6.9 or 7, so it's very neutral. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, now on to one of my favorite experiments, lighting conditions. It's a more recent one that I did. It did take a long time to do because I wanted to make sure I got a good pictures for the differences between these. And I think most people know that when you have an iridescent begonia, the lower the light you provide, the more vibrant the iridescence will be, and the higher light you provide, the more subtle the iridescence will be. But I wanted to know just how vibrant and just how subtle the differences were. So I took my Begonia species Sarawak, 3 different plants, and I put them each in different lighting conditions where they stayed for 2 or 3 months, I think, to really develop the most accurate coloring that I could. And the results were, yes, lower light yields deep purple blue tones and higher light yields pale blue/green tones. The darker the light, the more iridescence is shown. And I have some reference numbers for people who are interested. So the plant on the left is low light, the plant in the middle is medium light, and the plant on the right is bright light. And you can see there is a very clear difference in what your plant can look like in different lighting situations. So in low light, more navy, more indigo, definitely some purple in there as well. In the middle, it's more aqua blue, mid-toned blue, just beautiful turquoise colors. And then on the right, which is highlight, it's more green with like a wash of iridescence, I would say. All of them are beautiful, obviously. I think it just depends on the look that you're going for your plant. So I do suggest to experiment with your plants and you can have some fun. Okay, next, long-term cultivation in sphagnum. I just mentioned this before, that I've tried a couple different substrates in long-term cultivation to see what will Begonia species Sarawak tolerate, thrive in, die in, etc. So the first one I actually stumbled into by accident. It was long-term cultivation in sphagnum. And this is because when I first got my begonias, when I first got into them, I exclusively used sphagnum for about 6 or 7 months. There was not a drop of soil to be seen in my house. I was not a soil kind of a girl. I really loved sphagnum. And I didn't know that that love could turn into something detrimental until it actually happened to me. And that was when my plant got nutrient lockout. I have done many posts on this topic on my Instagram, so if you're interested, you can read all about them. I think I've done like 25 or 30 posts about nutrient lockout, and briefly, it's because my plant was living long-term in sphagnum, and that led to nutrient lockout. So the results. Under 6 months, yes, the plant can survive. Over 6 months, no, as it will lead to nutrient lockout. Long-term use of chemical fertilizer causes a buildup of salt in the substrate. This is true for any substrate. It's not exclusive to sphagnum. It's in soil, it's in pon. Well, actually, I don't know if it's in pon. I take that back. But even if you're using traditional soil potting mix, this can happen. So be wary. Salt buildup causes pH swings, and these pH swings don't allow your plant to utilize nutrients properly, thus leading to a decline in the plant. The treatment for nutrient lockout is to rinse the substrate and flush the salts out. However, sphagnum is completely detrimental in this regard because it is absorptive by nature, so it doesn't allow for proper flushing. So, in other words, if you are using chemical fertilizers on your plants, prolonged use of chemical fertilizers lead to salt buildup in your substrate. So that could be sphagnum, soil, etc. And as the salt builds up, it causes the pH to shift swings, right? And because the pH is moving so much, your plant cannot physically absorb the nutrients that you are giving to the plant. The plant is not able to absorb the nutrients. So what'll happen is you'll see a decline in your plant, and you'll see discoloration of the leaves, just overall lack of shine, no growth, etc. So you think, maybe, like I thought, oh, you need to add more fertilizer because something's not right. And when you give it more fertilizer, it leads to more salt buildup, which leads to more pH swings, which leads to a further decline in your plant. So it's a lose-lose situation. And I've done, like I mentioned, many posts on this. There's not a specific test that you can do for your plant to say, oh yes, I 100% have nutrient lockout, but you can do things like a pH test, or you can use a ppm meter and things like that. Again, if you're interested, please check out my Instagram. And long story short, this was the initiation of the mass repotting of my entire collection of my plants out of sphagnum and into soil. And, you know, soil's okay now that I've been using it for, I don't know, many months now. Soil's okay. I'm just not super thrilled. If I could have it my way, my plants would still be in sphagnum, but I definitely do not want to deal with this problem again, so that will not happen. But just something to be on the lookout for. Okay, next, long-term cultivation using Akadama. Purpose: can Begonia species Sarawak live long-term in Akadama? The results: under 3 months, yes. My hypothesis is because Akadama is inorganic despite using fertilizer water. Now, I don't know the exact reason for why this is. In my mind, it doesn't make sense for why the plant would die in the inorganic material if you're using fertilizer water. I've done some research into it. There's not really a whole lot out there other than the reason your plant is failing is because, Akadama by nature is inorganic. So something to look into, but I still recommend Akadama for propagations. And then once it gets to around the 2-month mark, that's when I will switch the plants out of Akadama into a soil mix. And that's just roughly about when the plant starts producing new leaves. I'll transfer it out of Akadama. Okay, long-term cultivation in sandstone. Purpose: can Begonia species Sarawak live long-term in sandstone? Results: under 3 months, yes. Like Akadama, my hypothesis is because sandstone is inorganic despite using fertilizer water. And you could see that picture on the right there. It's just poor little baby Sarawak that has since passed, RIP. And the last one there, long-term cultivation in limestone, it had the same exact results as sandstone. So there is a common theme here that when using sandstone, limestone, Akadama, pumice, some kind of rock substance that is inorganic, and you have your begonia growing in a completely inorganic situation, ultimately it will not thrive and it will die. Or at least that's what I've found with my Sarawak experiments. Okay, next, sunburn or ashing. Purpose: is there a difference between sunburn or ashing? Results: yes. Okay, so if you look at the picture on the right, on the left, that is an example of sunburn, and on the right, that is a picture of ashing. And you can see when they're side by side that, yes, they look totally different, but if you didn't have the comparison, you might not know that there is a difference. So with sunburn, that's the one on the left. It's dry, not flaky, beige with a darker border. It does not spread. It can be anywhere on your leaf. It can have holes, and it's caused by the sun. That is the main key here, takeaway that I want you guys to take away, is that it's caused by the sun. Okay, ashing. It's dry, it's flaky, it's gray-brown. It sometimes has a border, but not often. It can spread and most likely spreads. I have found that it's typically on the leaf margin. It's not necessarily right smack dab in the middle of your leaf. Usually starts on the perimeter. No holes, although if you leave the ashing to its own devices, I have seen it just wither away into nothing and flake into having holes. So that kind of depends on when you notice the ashing. And the cause is unknown. We know that ashing is a form of leaf melting, but we don't know exactly how or why plants do this ashing versus regular melting. And just for reference, I think everybody's familiar with regular leaf melting. It's usually that gooey, really dark brown, sticky, smelly type of goo. With ashing, it's not like that. It is a type of cell death, yes, but it's more dry and flaky. It's not wet and gooey. So there is a difference. Scientifically, we don't know the reason why. Okay, next, cobweb mold. This has been my most persistent situation with my begonias, although I have found so far, what has been a permanent solution to my cobweb mold. And that is with use of springtails. So the first time that I got cobweb mold was on my Begonia acetosa, and I used a Q-tip dipped in hydrogen peroxide, 3%, and I removed the cobweb mold. It was not on the soil yet. It was just on the base of the plant. So that could have something to do with why it never actually came back on my Begonia acetosa. The removal with the Q-tips actually not made it come back. So that was my first experience with cobweb mold. And then subsequently my Begonia blankii got cobweb mold, which was on the soil. And that is the only difference that I can really think of for why my hydrogen peroxide soil soaks and removal did not work on my Begonia blankii. It kept coming back. I was very frustrated with this cobweb mold to the point where I was diluting my hydrogen peroxide with water, and I was doing a soak about every other day because it just kept coming back. And then I was frustrated and I did not dilute the hydrogen peroxide. I just used it straight from the bottle and I poured it on the soil because I was so over the situation. I just wanted it to go away and it was not going away. So I thought that maybe not diluting the hydrogen peroxide would fix the issue. It did not. It came back the very next day. I was about ready to rip my hair out. I was so over it. And then I realized that I could use springtails, which are these adorable little animals. If you look down at that picture, look at how cute he is. He is technically not an insect. Because I think he lacks a mouth, and there's other criteria for insects that this springtail does not have. But I mean, if you were to look at that, it basically looks like an insect, but technically it's not. And they eat pathogenic fungi and bacteria. So they are like nature's cleanup crew. And they are an absolute lifesaver. Once I used them, I have not had cobweb mold since. Actually, that's a lie. I did have it one time in a Begonia species Sarawak propagation, but that was literally the only plant that I did not use springtails in. And since I've put springtails in there and I have not had a reoccurrence, and it's been months and months and months and months. So I highly recommend springtails for anybody that is suffering with mold issues, cobweb mold in particular. I love them. They are super, super cute. They do not fly. They just kind of crawl around, do their own thing. They are not a bother at all. So I do recommend them. Okay, rooting using tap water. Purpose: will Begonia species Sarawak root in tap water? Results: yes, but it will take twice as long, 7 versus 16 days. I was totally shocked by the results of this. And I think most people know that when using sensitive terrarium plants, begonias in general, you want to use distilled water, not tap water, because tap water has chemical additives like chlorine, and it has harsh minerals, and some can have harsh chemicals depending on where you live. City tap water, if you live in a city that has tap water, it's a quote unquote worse tap water than if you live in a rural environment and you use that tap water. So not all tap water is created equally. I'm not saying if you use tap water, your begonias will definitely die. I can just speak to my experience, and when I used tap water on one of my begonia species Sarawak propagations, it took longer to root and eventually it died, which is that second long-term cultivation using tap water right below what I'm talking about here. So I think it depends. I think if you're in a bind, I have personally used tap water when I was in a bind, and I went to my grocery store like on 3 separate occasions, and they did not restock their distilled water, but I obviously needed to water my plants. So, when you're in a bind, like, you can use tap water. I have used it in the past. I just don't make it a habit to use tap water because I live in a city, and the city tap water is not created equally. I do know there is a website on there. If you look up what town you're living in, you can see what grade your tap water is. So maybe if you have a better grade of tap water, it won't be as detrimental to your plant as if you're using a lower grade. But, you have to do your own research when it comes to that. But as far as rooting is concerned, it took twice as long, and I was very surprised by that. The long-term cultivation using tap water, I took that same propagation that rooted in tap water. I kept everything exactly the same with this propagation. I had a separate bottle which was filled with tap water with diluted fertilizer, and I watered that specific plant with that specific bottle of water with tap water. Everything else was the same: the light, temperature, humidity, etc. And after 3 months, the propagation died. And I think it is important to note that I did repot the plant 2 weeks before the plant passed away. So is it possible that the repotting of this plant had a role in the death? Yes, it's possible. However, I'm not inclined to believe that because I already know that the plant did not care for the tap water because it took twice as long for the plant to root in it. So I'm more inclined to believe that it was the tap water. But I think it's important to note that possibly the repotting of the plant led to its death. However, we do know in my previous experiments that the plant can't live long-term in Akadama. So hold on, let me go back. So it was living in that little cup of Akadama, that top picture there, for a while, and then I didn't want it to die from living long-term in Akadama, so I repot it. So it needed to be repot anyway. Okay, next, Akadama versus pumice versus sandstone. Which stone is best for fastest rooting? These are one of my favorite kind of experiments to do. I love rooting things. So the results, Akadama, yay, we love Akadama here. So Akadama, pH 6.9, small pieces, 5 millimeter pieces, and it took 7 days to root. Then I took another propagation, leaf propagation, with pumice, pH of 7, also small pieces, but larger than the Akadama. So that should really say medium pieces there. And it took 10 days to root. Then with my sandstone, pH 7.5 to 8, this was large pieces, and it took 15 days. So from this, I can conclude that the smaller the pieces, the faster the plant will root. And obviously this was a very small sample size. Take these experiments with a grain of salt. I always encourage people to do their own experiments with their own plants because their living environment is different than mine. But from this experiment, I can comfortably say that the smaller the pieces, the faster the plant will root. I believe, my opinion, not a fact, but in my opinion, It has to do with the smaller pieces allowing for more oxygen to the roots. And I also think that with these sensitive terrarium begonias, their roots are so fragile and they're so thin and delicate that when they're growing, that it might make it easier if you're using smaller pieces, because the roots can travel more effortlessly and they can grow more effortlessly through the substrate versus with large pieces. Again, that's just my opinion. I don't know that for sure. Okay, next, sport variegation. Will isolating a sport variegated leaf yield more sport variegation? So I'm sure everybody knows what sport variegation is, but it is just a type of leaf mutation in one or all layers of the leaf. If you look at the picture that I have associated with this experiment, that lime green section towards the margin, that is the sport variegation. The variegation more towards the upper left, that dark brown chocolate color, that is typical or normal variegation for this plant. So I use this leaf specifically for this because I wanted to show the difference between something that is sport variegated and something that has normal variegation, and this leaf has both. Unpopular opinion, but this is just a side note. I don't think sport variegation is all that rare. I know it was very hyped up a few years ago. I have multiple plants that have developed sport variegation, so I don't think it's all that rare, but it does happen. I wouldn't say it's necessarily common, but it does happen, and it happens more often in propagations, at least to me. The mother plant may not have sport variegation, but let's say I took a propagation from it and it all of a sudden developed sport variegation. That's just in my experience though, and as a side note. So for those of you who want to elicit more sport variegation, if you cut that leaf off of your mother plant and you root it and you watch it grow, will it have more sport variegation than if you just left it on the mother plant? The answer is yes. You can elicit more sport variegation by isolating and propagating the leaf. Out of the 5 new leaves that this plant produced, 1 has sport variegation. 1 in 5 is 20%. The mother plant has 2 in 17 leaves, or 12%, and another propagation that I have has 2 in 12 leaves, or 17%. So again, with this small sample size, you can conclude that if you isolate and propagate a leaf with sport variegation, you can elicit more of the variegation. Next, high humidity versus water contact. What will make roots faster, high humidity or water contact? So here I took 2 small leaves. I had one hovering above a shot glass of water, so it was not actually touching the water, but it was suspended right above the water. And then the other one I had with the little petiole touching the water. And that little green plastic thing is just a floss stick, because I didn't want the foliage to be sitting in the water because I didn't want it to melt and die. So I just used this to levitate the leaf blade above the water, but I wanted the petiole to touch the water for water contact. So that's just what that is. So the results: water contact, it rooted after 11 days. And the humidity propagation died after 11 days, and it was totally melted and dead. I was a little shocked by that because in the beginning, I thought that both of these propagations would root, but the one with high humidity would just take longer. I didn't expect it to actually die. So just food for thought. Make sure your plant has some sort of water contact. Okay, next, diagonal petiole cut. Purpose: will cutting the petiole on a diagonal change the amount of time it usually takes to root? So normally I've always cut straight across. I wanted to see if cutting on a diagonal would yield more roots or faster roots. My initial hypothesis, I thought that it would be yes. I thought that because cutting on an angle, you're kind of creating more surface area, at least on the bottom of the petiole. So I thought For the initial rooting process, it would go faster. However, that did not happen. So the results. After 17 days, the leaf did not root. Typically, it takes Begonia sarawak 7 to 8 days in similar conditions to root. Akadama deli container, leaf of a similar size. So the plant did not like to be cut on a diagonal. I don't know the reasoning behind that. I just know that I do not cut on a diagonal. I cut on a, straight across. So I thought that was very, very interesting, and I don't know the science behind it. Okay, off of the experiments and onto some common problems. Okay, so stressed plants. This is a Begonia lichtenora for reference here. If in the wild the plant grows sideways along a surface and in cultivation you have it unsupported or growing up, it will become stressed. This is true. If you have a crawling begonia, so if you have a lichtenora or the species sarawak or the species cowbang, those are some that I showed earlier, those crawl along the surface. So they can crawl sideways, they can crawl vertically, but they have to have support underneath because they root at the nodes and they root down. And their roots are very shallow. So if you have a crawling plant and let's say only the bottom 2 nodes are in the pot, right, in the soil, and the rest of the plant is just willy-nilly dangling around up in the air, you can fling it around, it has no support, that is going to lead to stress because naturally, in its natural environment, each node is rooted into the substrate. So if you just have 2 roots, in a pot and the rest of the plant is dangling about, that's not natural for these plants. These plants don't naturally grow up. They grow sideways or they grow like up something. They don't just dangle. They don't grow upwards. So that's not natural for them. So if you have a plant that's maybe not thriving in your environment and you notice that it looks like a crawler, try repotting it and putting it on its side. Okay, next, splitting petioles. I have not ever heard of this, seen this before. I had no idea what it was when I first got this plant. Luckily, Vagina Begonia came to the rescue again with all of her vast begonia knowledge. This is a Begonia xanthina for reference. I started getting these splits in my petiole and I had no idea why. And then it would callus over and it would turn that brown color there that you see. And it wasn't a pest. I just had no idea what was going on with the plant. I did research. I could not find anything. So I went to my go-to person and she said that it could be that the plant has absorbed too much water. The water had nowhere to go. So it just wound up splitting the petioles. And I've not ever had this since, so this is kind of, I want to say, a rare problem. I've not heard of anybody else really having this issue. So if you happen to see this on your plants, it could be that the plant is absorbing too much water and it's callusing over where those splits are. Orange roots. This is something that I have also not seen ever in a begonia. Orange roots, like, it's just so bizarre to me. So when I first noticed that my plant had these orange roots, I thought it was root rot, but it also didn't make sense to me because there was no smell, the roots were firm, there was not anything wrong with my plant whatsoever. It's just that these roots looked an orange color and I didn't know what it was. So I did research on orange roots and that led to a lot of posts about correcting hair color, hair roots. So then I put orange plant roots and that led me to articles about snake plants because I think naturally their roots are orange or something. So I could not find anything in regards to a begonia that has orange roots. And so I reached out to my one friend gardening in Canada. She is absolutely lovely. She does outdoor gardening, but I asked her, she's a soil scientist for reference, so she also knows exactly what she's talking about, and she's a pretty solid source for me. And I sent her pictures and I asked, do you know why these roots are orange? I did research, I can't find the answer. Do you know what it could be? And to quote her, this is what she said: exposing the roots will cause the outer layers to thicken and protect against dehydration, thus leading to staining or an orange color. So that made a whole lot of sense to me, because this is the oldest node on my Begonia Sarawak, and it is not covered by substrate at all. And so, as she's saying, it's exposed to the elements, it's exposed to the environment. And so it led the roots to thicken and cause this staining color, the orange color. So I did ask around in, the begonia community, or at least the few people that I speak to. They have not heard of this or seen this, so you might not ever see this or hear of this again, but in case you do, it is normal. Okay, next, an unsupported petiole or stem. This is my Begonia tomentosa, my import. It started growing, this is when I first noticed that it started growing really wonky, and the weight of this new stem here, this new offshoot, was so heavy that it was going to snap. So what I did was I took a straw and I cut it lengthwise and I wrapped it around to create a little cast. And it totally worked, because you can see the new leaves on the far right side and in the front of where that little cast is. And it just worked. So if you have a plant that needs a little support, try using a straw as like a little makeshift cast because it could work. Okay, cobweb mold, we did talk about this before, so I'll just briefly go into it again. This was my Begonia acetosa, the first instance that I had with cobweb molds. So I use springtails, hexapods that feed on pathogenic fungi and bacteria. You increase your light, increase your airflow, and allow soil to fully dry out. And my friend here, Botanical Lee, was the first one that really gave me good information about springtails, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned them for proper credit. Okay, next, stem rot. I feel like everybody has been here with stem rot. We don't like stem rot. So you want to remove the node above the rot. It might visibly look healthy, but rot infects the tissue on the inside before presenting on the outside. So if you look at that picture that I have for reference here, you might want to cut right in that middle section there. So right where it's black and then it starts to look healthy, you might cut in that first little section there. But I would be hesitant to do that, and I would actually suggest to cut right above that. So the picture actually kind of cuts off exactly where I would suggest to cut. And I know, when you see this on your plant, you want to try to salvage as much of your plant as possible. You don't want to cut that extra node because it looks good, but I've seen this a few different times with my plants that node is going to most likely go anyway, because it's most likely infected on the inside already. So instead of prolonging the issue, just cut it off, because it can actually be more detrimental and the rot could spread even further. So then you could wind up cutting off more of your plant than if you just took off the, quote unquote, healthy looking node that was infected on the inside. So I do suggest doing that. Okay, stunted leaves. Stunted leaves are normal. They are functional. Nothing necessarily wrong with them other than they are stunted. And I found that it's mainly caused by stress. So repotting, dehydration, you let your plant dry out too much, pests, root rot, stem rot, etc. Anything that can really stress your plant out, can lead to these little deformed, stunted leaves. And you can cut them off, but like I said, there's nothing functionally wrong with them. They still photosynthesize and, whatnot. So you can cut them off or leave them. I leave mine on. Okay, next, curled leaves. So I think we know a lot of the reasons for curled leaves already. It could be over-fertilization, under-fertilization, you watered too much, you watered too little. I'm here to suggest that it could be a lesser known reason, which is a moisture imbalance. And that is where there is no differentiation between the moisture in the environment and the moisture in the substrate. So for example, if you have a water propagation in a closed terrarium that's 99% humidity, it's wet on wet. And I also wanted to give proper credit to Vagina Begonia because she also helped me out with this issue. She suggested that my leaves were curling because I had it in water, which is obviously wet environment, and the humidity was 99%. So it was wet on wet. There was no room for differentiation. It was just wet on wet. So that was causing the leaves to curl. And she suggested that I remove it from the water and repot it. And at first I was hesitant to do that because I only had about 1/4 of an inch of roots. I didn't really have that much roots in the water. So I wanted to leave it in the water, but I also knew that the leaves curling was an issue that needed to be addressed because all of the new foliage that was coming out was starting to curl. So I did follow her advice and I repot, and then the problem went away. So she was right about the moisture imbalance. So again, there's not really that much information on this topic out there. So just in case you have a similar problem, it could be a moisture imbalance. Okay, melting with densely hairy begonia propagations. This is Begonia tomentosa for reference. So I've tried propagating this plant in sphagnum, in soil, in water. All of them failed, and I mean all of them failed. It wasn't until I started using Akadama for this very, very hairy begonia that it did not melt and that I was actually able to be successful in propagating it. So if you have a begonia with very hairy stems or petioles and you're trying to propagate it, try using Akadama over other medias. Okay, next, acclimation/importing stress. So when you import plants, you have to expect that there is going to be some form of plant stress, whether that be leaf melting or stem melting or root rot, or there's just going to be some form of outward visible stress to your plant. And that goes for acclimating any of your plants, even if it's not an import, but more so with importing, I have found personally. So what I do to acclimate new plants is I use medium light. I don't use bright light because, as we discussed before, that can lead to stress. Also low light, you need your plant to photosynthesize. So medium light, at least 85% humidity, a small enclosed terrarium. Don't touch it, expect melting, just mentioned that, and immediately take a propagation for insurance. This is just because even if your plant acclimates fine, your plant could always crash. There's always a possibility that your plant is going to suffer at some point in the future. So it's always good to have a backup of your plant. This has happened to me twice where I took a leaf right when I first got the plant. Everything was going fine with the original plant and the propagation, and then months go by and the mother plant all of a sudden crashes and dies. And I'm very thankful that I had the propagations because I was obviously still able to have the species. And in this picture I'm showing here, this is a begonia species green. It looks like a Begonia melana bellata, but instead of brown cones, it's just all green. And I recently just bought this plant on October 2nd, and it did not like shipping whatsoever. It started off with a lot of little leaves and no rot whatsoever. And now a week has gone by and it is probably going to die. It has root rot. This is what's left of the rhizome. All of my leaf propagations and stem propagations that I've taken, and I've probably taken about 20 at this point, have all melted. So I do think I will lose this species, but I mean, that just happens. These are live beings, so there is always a possibility that it is going to die during transit, and this is my most recent fail. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation. Thank you everyone that has watched this presentation, and again, thank you to the Begonia branch, the San Francisco branch of the American Begonia Society, for asking me to speak on this topic. I had a lot of fun creating this presentation. Again, if you want to find me on Instagram, it's at Begonia Sarawak. My Etsy shop is Aesthetic Foliage, and my Amazon storefront you can find through the link in my Instagram, just to make it easy. So I hope everybody has a good day and everybody learned something. And again, thank you for having me.